Hello and welcome to Anti-Natalism This Week. Rattlesnake TV, which has over 879,000 subscribers, hosted a debate between Amanda Suknick and Rachel Wilson on the topic of antinatalism. My expectation was that they would start by understanding the position of antinatalism and of pronatalism. Instead, they started by ambushing Amanda with some old clips and red button experiment. But anyway, there are some things that Rachel said which are in need of a response. I am not going to respond to the entire video because that will take like 10 hours, but I've chosen some arguments from Rachel.
So, Amanda's view is that people's will to live is kind of a thinly veiled cope for dealing with the horrors of existence. I believe it's actually her position, which is the thinly veiled cope for dealing with the resentment of actually being arrogant enough to believe you have existence all figured out and that you, as a finite human being, have the capability to see all ends and know all things sufficiently to judge existence as pointless suffering, which should have never begun and must end as soon as ethically possible.
I think she said many things here, so let's take one thing at a time.
So, Amanda's view is that people's will to live is kind of a thinly veiled cope for dealing with the horrors of existence.
I'm not going to defend Amanda here. I'm not going to defend what Amanda's view is. And that is also one of my problems with this particular debate. That is, it was framed as a personal view rather than a view in itself. But anyway, the question is Rachel's statement true about antinatalism and those who hold the view of antinatalism? Do antinatalists think that people's will to live is a kind of thinly veiled cope for dealing with horrors of life? The will to live is deeply ingrained within us. I don't think antinatalists think of that will to live as anything superficial. That is also why antinatalists are against killing because they think that the will to live or will to continue to live has to be respected because it's a serious thing. Now, there are other things which could be described as thinly veiled cope for dealing with horrors of life. For example, we might take hobbies, we might distract ourselves by enjoying sitcoms, but then that being a thinly veiled cope is already recognized by everybody, not just antinatalists.
I believe it's actually her position, which is the thinly veiled cope for dealing with the resentment of actually being arrogant enough to believe you have existence all figured out and that you, as a finite human being, have the capability to see all ends and know all things sufficiently to judge existence as pointless suffering, which should have never begun and must end as soon as ethically possible.
I'm going to ignore the aggressive language like allegation of arrogance and resentfulness. That's a distraction that just shows Rachel's frustration. So let's leave that aside. But her main allegation is antinatalists think that they have figured out existence and they think that existence is pointless suffering. Well, first of all, I don't think antinatalists claim that they have figured out existence in the sense that they have figured out all aspects of existence. Even David Benatar has spoken about fallibility, that there could be a chance that he is wrong, and he is open to it, and so are antinatalists, and so is Amanda. So there's nothing arrogant about it. Now let's look at the pointless suffering part. Is there a purpose to existence of sentient beings or humanity as a whole? On an individual level, you can have a purpose. I have a purpose of talking about antinatalism, and that is enough for me to draw a meaning on an individual level. But is there a purpose for humanity as a whole or all sentient life? Would it matter to anyone else in the universe if this experiment of sentient life on this planet is not there? So far, there is no evidence for there being any other purpose beyond our own existence, and in whatever part I have seen of this debate, Rachel does not provide any evidence to such a purpose either. So, on the whole, it is pointless, although you can have individual meaning. And is there suffering in this existence? I think Rachel would agree that there is suffering. So, I don't know what problem Rachel has with this reasoning. Now, I don't think the pointlessness of humanity or sentient existence on its own entails antinatalism. It just negates the pronatalist argument that we need to have children for some kind of a higher purpose where there is none. Which brings me to the earlier point of allegation of having figured out existence. This allegation could be made to any position about procreation and specifically to the position where you are creating new existence. It seems if there is anything arrogant, it is the act of creating new sentient being.
I think that there's no current technology we're aware of that guarantees that you could end all sentient life or end all life altogether.
We don't have that technology, partly because we have not looked in this direction. In fact, we are looking in a completely opposite direction today. We are trying to populate Mars. We are trying to de extinct the species which are already extinct. We are trying to create sentient AI, either on purpose or otherwise. So, we are in a completely opposite direction as of today.
I think that there's no current technology we are aware of that guarantees that you could end all sentient life or end all life altogether. Pragmatic solution would be to encourage as many Christians as possible to procreate, thereby limiting suffering among all sentient species, since wiping life out is at this point off the table.
I would be careful with expressions like wiping life out because it could mean, on the one end, wiping it out by killing, and on the other, letting it die out. There could also be a mix of those two things, but for the sake of argument, let's gloss over that difference. What Rachel is saying is since we cannot have a world where there is no sentient life, let us continue to create more humans. The assumption here is that the more humans there are, the less animals there will be, and therefore lesser the suffering. The problem is, it is not clear to me that just by having more humans, even Christian humans, there is lesser suffering. There are some aspects in which humans suffer more than other animals. For example, humans think about their death. They have existential angst. They have anxiety about future. Not many animals tend to show this behavior. Two, humans are a deadly species. Think of factory farms, the amount of cruelty that goes on in factory farms, and the amount of cruelty that humans impose on other humans in forms of war, injustice, slavery, and so on. This is not insignificant. You could argue that human extinction should not happen before sentient extinction happens, but that is different than saying that since we cannot achieve extinction of all species, let's have children.
And I think that you can't do that with compassion without making the argument for what at least would be better, what at least would be the right thing, even if we don't have the tools to do that. How can that happen in the most graceful, compassionate way possible?
Sure. So that was all kind of a big plea like, I'm not a monster. What I'm saying is actually compassionate. Just like I said in my opening, I think this is going to be constantly framed as I'm actually the nice one. Rachel wants you all to exist and suffer. I, Amanda, care so much that I think you'd all be better off.
Rachel,
And
I
here's the
don't I
thing.
don't think you're a
This
bad person. I really
well,
don't.
This was completely unnecessary framing. She later clarifies that what she meant was Amanda's and her worldview, but to frame it in such a childish way was not civil and it was not necessary.
how do you know that there's no reason or purpose behind suffering?
This seems to be a deliberately abstract question. We are talking about purpose behind suffering of whom and for whom. So let's zero it down on an individual level. Let's take my own case. I suffer in my life. Is there a purpose to that suffering? I mean, creating these videos and going through what Rachel is saying is suffering enough. And I'm going through it. So is there a purpose for it? Yes, there is a purpose because talking about antinatalism and making responses gives me a sense of purpose and a sense of meaning. So, on an individual level, that suffering gives me a purpose. But it is that particular suffering. It cannot be generalized to all suffering that I have to go through in my life, even on an individual level. Not every suffering that I go through will have a purpose. Let's say I get cancer. What could be the purpose of cancer and the suffering of going through it? Now, I could get cured of that cancer, and that might bring a very positive change in my mindset towards looking at life. As a result, I might enjoy life more than I would otherwise. Does that mean the suffering of going through the cancer had a purpose? Cancer is a lump of cells reproducing without control. The cells don't know nor care who you are and what your purpose is. Change in my mindset is an incidental consequence of going through and having cured cancer. It's not the purpose of cancer. And even if, for the sake of argument, we agree that it was purpose of cancer, I would question, can I not get that positive mindset by going through some therapy instead of getting cancer?
How do you know that I'm wrong and that you're correct about the nature of life and that there is no creator and that this is all just a biological accident?
This is a debate between atheism and theism and not about antinatalism because there are many atheists who are pronatalists. So to bring up like the existence of creator here is misplaced. Now, I know that Rachel's pronatalism is predicated on there being a God and God telling her to have children. So, the burden of proof then is on Rachel to demonstrate that there is such a God and that God has told her to have children.
So, like,
Sure.
I love working out. I've been weightlifting for 17 years. Leg day is both pain and suffering and pleasure and satisfaction for me
Yeah.
and for everybody else who's ever done a hard leg day. Can you tell me where the line is between suffering and pleasure, and how do we know where that line is?
So there are four answers to her question. One, the instrumental value of suffering is different than the intrinsic value of suffering, meaning you could achieve something positive by paying the cost of suffering, but that suffering is still a cost, something which is negative in and of itself. Two, the line between pain and pleasure in Rachel's example of working out is very well subjective. The act of working out could be painful and pleasurable at the same time. For me, the activity of doing, let's say, 5 sets of a particular exercise is enough, and anything beyond that is more painful than it is pleasurable. Likewise, the activity of just 1 set is not enough for me to derive pleasure. So it is subjective, but at least we agree that there are some activities in life which are both pleasurable and painful. But wherever the line between the two is, it does not matter in the case when we are thinking of procreation. Because before coming into existence, that being is not deprived of any kinds of pleasures, whether they are pure pleasures, whether they come through painful activities, or whatever the source of pleasure be, they are not deprived of that. And lastly, this example is a trivial example. As I said, there are serious sufferings in life like cancer, like rapes, murders, for which this calculus of an activity being painful and pleasurable at the same time does not really apply. It could provide meaning to your life, but that is the incidental consequence of your suffering and not a justification for your suffering. If it was a justification, then we could have said that apartheid was justified because it provided meaning to Nelson Mandela's life.
So, with this problem that you have, if life has no meaning, there is no God, there are no higher duties, then we have no reason we ought to value consent. We have no reason we ought to care about suffering whatsoever.
So there are three parts to this argument. She is assuming that you need to have a God in order to be good. But think about it. If you need God to be good, are you really being good? If you are not stealing from someone just because there is a God watching you, otherwise you would steal, are you really being good? If your morality needs a God to be watching you all the time, then is that even a morality? And there are many atheist thinkers like Peter Singer, for example, who have done such a tremendous job about effective altruism. So to say that if you don't believe in God, you don't have to care about anything is too simplistic and unstudied. Now, there is still a way to turn this on its head. You can say that by being moral and by trying to be good, you are believing in God even though you say you don't believe in God. You say that it's not going to be sunny today, but while going out, you put on your shades. That tells that even though you are saying that it is not going to be sunny, you actually believe that it is going to be sunny outside. There are criticisms to this argument. In the shade analogy, there could be alternative explanations for putting on shades. You might have an eye infection which necessitates you to put on shades. So, just because someone's actions resemble belief in eggs doesn't mean they actually believe in eggs. Their actions might have another explanation. And all of this is still about having a sense of morality without believing in God. This is not about for or against having children. And we will revisit this again when we look at the transcendental arguments for God. Thirdly, she is confusing between two forms of nihilism. Nihilism, in simple words, is a view that nothing matters and we don't value anything. There is one form called existential nihilism, which says that whether we exist or not, we as either in humanity or sentient life or life on this planet exists or not, it doesn't matter. And then there is moral nihilism, which is the view that nothing is right or wrong, nothing really matters, so you can behave as you want. And I don't think existential nihilism automatically leads to moral nihilism. You can accept that our existence as a whole has no meaning and yet create meaning on an individual level. And you can have alternatives to God to decide right from wrong. There are many such views. One of them could be suffering-focused ethics. We can start with the axiom that suffering is intrinsically bad, and then we can develop further normative positions.
What, in a nutshell, is your answer to the question of how we define what's good?
Suffering is bad. I mean, it's possible for some philosopher to come along and say, oh, no, I think suffering is good. And you can't totally argue against that. I just think it's a horrible thing to say.
And you cannot, your worldview basically, if you're wrong and there is a God and life after this mortal life is eternal, you're basically condemning everyone to eternal suffering if you ever got your way and had extinction. Me, on the other hand, if I'm right, at least some people get eternal well-being. Maybe a lot of people get eternal well-being, and those who didn't ended up there because of their own free will. And if I'm wrong, all we get is what, and you're right? If you're right about the world, then when we die, we just have everlasting neutrality, everlasting peace. We just go to sleep, we never wake up, and we suffered for a short, finite amount of time when we were here, but that's not so bad. So I would say that.
So there is a false comparison to start with. Rachel is taking the case of extinction on the antinatalist side. Extinction is on a collective level. It could be on the level of species like humanity or all sentient life. But when she is talking about pronatalist side, she is taking the case of an individual. If you want to do a proper comparison, and if you're taking a collective level on one side, that is extinction, then you also need to take the collective level in case of pronatalism. Rachel is applying Pascal's wager to the case of having children, or to be precise, to the case of avoiding extinction. Pascal's wager is an argument by Blaise Pascal for why one should believe in God. If there exists a God, and if we don't believe in him or her, then we risk going to hell for eternity after we die. But if there is no God, and if we believe in God, then the risk of believing something which is not true is limited to only our short lifetime. That's Pascal's wager for believing in God. Just as a side note, Pascal himself never had any children. Not that it matters for our argument, but just to note. Rachel mixes Pascal's wager with extinction in a weird way.
If you're wrong and there is a God and life after this mortal life is eternal, you're basically condemning everyone to eternal suffering if you ever got your way and had extinction.
So she is saying that if everyone who already exists adopts the atheist worldview, and if they are wrong, that is, God actually exists, then they will face eternal suffering. I assume they will get this eternal suffering after they die. This argument is true irrespective of whether or not extinction occurs, or whether or not new generations come into existence subsequently, because these already existing people will die eventually. Maybe Rachel is tweaking Pascal's wager. She means that one has to believe in God and also obey his command to have children. So it is not enough that they believe that God exists, but they also have to have children. If they don't, and if that results in extinction, then they will suffer forever. Note that in this case, we will have finite number of people suffering for infinite length of time. On the other hand, she says that if they have children wrongly believing in God's command to be fruitful and multiply, then these people will suffer only for their limited lifetime, and that's it. So in the first case, we had eternal suffering, but in the second case, we had limited suffering only for the length of the individual lifetime. Therefore, it is a safe bet to believe in God and to obey his command of having children. But Rachel does not consider the children which are produced as a result. These children now face the wager, and if Rachel's argument is correct, then they also have to have children of their own. So it is multiple generations of lifetimes in an endless cycle. And so we have infinite number of people suffering for finite lifetimes, but still for infinite length of time. It is not like infinite number of people suffered for 100 years and that's it. There is no more suffering. The cycle of suffering will continue endlessly for infinite length of time. Just the individuals will suffer for finite time. And because the cycle is endless, the number of individuals is also infinite. You can do the arithmetic in both scenarios and compare. Here is one such calculation, and as you can see, the suffering in both cases is infinite. Now, I have not produced this myself. I just asked AI to calculate this. Secondly, the calculation is too simplistic and makes assumptions. Thirdly, we can change some parameters to prove any scenario better or worse. Like counting suffering per person would yield different result than counting suffering per unit of time. But despite all of this, I think This demonstrates the flaw in Rachel's argument. It is also interesting that earlier Rachel was appealing to pragmatism, but here she bases her action on hypothetical imaginary beings. If Rachel is truly pragmatic, then she would agree that we should take actions based on what we know for certain instead of on theoretical possibilities. And we know for certain that sentient life contains serious suffering in it. I'm not saying that life is suffering, I'm saying sentient life contains serious suffering in it, and death is a certainty to almost everyone. So it makes sense to err on the side of caution and go by what we know for sure.
Did I hear you say that you're a caregiver?
Yeah. Yes, I'm a caregiver.
Would that be for elder people, sick people, children?
An elderly person. I'd rather not get into
Sure.
my personal circumstances.
I don't want you to dox
don't really see
yourself.
how
I
that
don't want you to
matters.
give any details, but well, I think it matters tremendously. I would not want someone taking care of elderly people who thinks that life is not worth living and that sentient life should be wiped out. That seems
Okay,
like a
that's fine.
major conflict of interest.
No, it's not. And it sounds like Rachel does not know the difference between life worth continuing and life worth starting. She thinks that because antinatalists think that life is not worth starting, they automatically think that an existing life would not be worth continuing, and therefore an antinatalist taking care of an elderly person is a risk because they might kill them. But that's not actually true. Antinatalists recognize that once a life has started, it has an interest in continuing, and that interest has to be respected, whereas before starting a life, there is no such interest of either coming into existence or continuing that existence, and therefore no life is worth starting.
Have you ever heard of the transcendental argument for God and the argument that transcendental categories prove there must be? Okay, you
No.
should probably look that up sometime. It's probably beyond the scope of this, but do you think that the laws of logic are discovered or did we create them?
I think that they're discovered.
Okay, so that would lend to the idea that something beyond the physical material world pre-exists this physical material world, that some mind had to exist for this physical world to exist. So you're not actually a biological essentialist. You're not actually a full materialist, and you don't even know it. I just expected more from somebody who wrote a philosophy book. I thought we were going to get into negative utilitarianism. I was Philbroing, I was like exercising my Philbro muscles in my brain because I haven't used them in a while because I'm usually just debating feminists who are like, I don't know, I just think like I should be able to do whatever I want and stuff.
So she brings the transcendental argument for God in the discussion about procreation. Now, before we go into the transcendental argument for God, let's first understand the transcendental part. That is a part which is beyond just the material. We know a simple rule in Euclidean plane geometry that all three angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees. But have we seen a perfect triangle whose angles add to exactly 180 degrees? Not 179.9999 or not 180.0001, but exactly 180 to infinite precision. We have not seen it. So then the question is, do these perfect triangles really exist? And are the triangles that we can draw in real life just the approximations of those perfect triangles? One could argue that the fact that we can draw imprecise approximations of those perfect triangles must exist somewhere in a non-material world. Mathematicians have thought about numbers in a similar way. We can also apply this to logic and morality. We all use logic. For example, A cannot be both A and not A. We trust our reasoning and we believe some things are right or wrong. These ideas are not made of matter and they don't change. They are universal and absolute. But in a purely material or atheistic world, everything would just be physical and changing. There would be no permanent universal rules of logic or morality. Therefore, the very fact that we can think logically or morally points to a non-material, unchanging mind, God, as the source. And that is the argument Rachel is bringing up here. If you accept the logic of antinatalism, then you could still believe in the transcendental argument for God and yet be an antinatalist. You could say that there exists logic, reasoning, and morality of antinatalism, indicating there exists such a God. Such a God would not be Rachel's traditional Christian God who would tell people to be fruitful and multiply. It would probably be an antinatalist God. One counter argument would be, if such an antinatalist God exists, why would he create a world with sentient life in it to start with? But this is analogous to the problem of evil in case of traditional Christian God, where the question is, if all-powerful, all-knowing, benevolent God exists, why would he create a world with so much evil and suffering in it? One of the answers to the problem of evil is that God has created this world for you to grow from it, for you to learn from this evil, for you to experience pleasure which you can't do without experiencing suffering. And same could be argued for the antinatalist God, that he created this world with sentient life in it for it to experience the logic and reason. Also, there are many criticisms for the original transcendental argument for God. But the point is that transcendental argument for God is an argument to figure out whether God exists or not. It is not an argument to figure out whether we should have children or not.
So I was just going to summarize quickly what I heard from Amanda was she said that she doesn't believe Christianity is true, not because she can't demonstrate that it's not true, but because she just doesn't see a good reason to believe it.
Rachel is saying that Amanda has not demonstrated that Christianity is not true or that God does not exist, and so her arguments are unfounded. Rachel provided Pascal's wager for belief in existence of God. Rachel also proposed a version of Pascal's wager as applied to procreation, therefore justifying the act of having children. Then she invoked the transcendental arguments for existence of God. All of this was for a Christian God who has commanded us to be fruitful and multiply. With this much, Rachel thinks that now the burden of proof is on Amanda to prove that God does not exist or that Christianity is not true. I think Rachel is hasty in transferring the burden of proof over to Amanda. The arguments that Rachel has provided, like Pascal's wager or transcendental arguments for God, have been criticized by many philosophers and could be rejected. But even if we accept those arguments, they help us in forming a hypothesis about one, existence of a God or belief in existence of God, two, that God being a Christian God, and three, that God telling us to have children. They don't provide us the evidence to prove the hypothesis to be true. So let's take an analogy. When I lift an apple, I feel its weight. I feel that weight because the earth is pulling it down against my arm. That means when I drop it, it will fall on the ground. That is a hypothesis. And since I am making the claim, the burden to provide the evidence for that claim is on me. To prove the hypothesis, I must drop apples and observe that they really fall on ground. Similarly, the arguments that Rachel has put forth, even if we accept those arguments, the burden of proof to provide evidence is still on Rachel because she is making that claim. Moreover, reasons for holding a belief and evidence of truthfulness of that belief can be two different things. I can believe that earth is flat because that's how it appears to me, and I can function very well with that belief. But that is not the evidence that the earth is really flat. Rachel provides a reason for having a belief, that is belief in God and having children, but she does not provide evidence for its truthfulness. Instead of providing that evidence, she goes on attacking Amanda and asks Amanda for proof. This is like Bertrand Russell's teapot. After about an hour into the video, Rachel's attack starts turning into rants, and that results in a shouting match. At that point, I lost interest and I left it. Maybe she comes back with the proper evidence and arguments later on, and I am wrong. At any rate, I want to congratulate Amanda for putting up honestly and decently with a lot of frustration thrown at her and words put in her mouth that she didn't actually say. Now, when we talk about antinatalism, we often talk about coming into existence, like harms of coming into existence. Most of the time, existence here is assumed to be sentient and individual. But that is not the only perspective through which we can think of existing. And that is the subject of a very short 3-minute video by Mati Haire. He extends the series of monism and dualism to trialism to show that we can think of our existence in 3 different forms. It's a subject only peripheral to antinatalism, but it is still interesting because a deeper understanding of our existence helps understanding antinatalist and even pronatalist arguments. Dr. Ben Bradley is a professor of philosophy at Syracuse University in the US. He was interviewed on a channel called Jason Chen about antinatalism, and this was really an engaging and interesting discussion, even though most of the times both of them did not agree with antinatalism. They discussed Shauna Schifrin's consent argument, David Benetta's axiological asymmetry, empirical asymmetry, quality of life, and the comparison of death and birth. I thoroughly enjoyed this 53-minute long video, and I must say, this This was in stark contrast to the Rachel Wilson's way of arguing. Another such good video was by Maya the Mumbler. Does the good in life outweigh the bad? This video is deep and funny at the same time. It is made perfectly for the younger audience. Maya the Mumbler creates lists to make arguments for antinatalism. Lists of good and bad things about nature, good and bad things about life, some undeniable truths, and so on. Animal cruelty, suffering, ethics, compassion are some of the recurring themes. It's about 50-minute long but very entertaining and a must watch for some light antinatalist content. After a long time, Lawrence made an episode of antinatalism around the world, this time antinatalism in Kenya. It's an interview of Aziz, who comes from a Muslim background. He's now an ex-Muslim, so there are a lot of references to Islamic culture and Islamic literature and religious thinking and how he molds his arguments accordingly. Aziz had appeared previously on 2 other podcasts talking about antinatalism, and he seems to have a very good understanding of Islamic literature and religion. We also come to know that Aziz has now become vegan, or at least agrees with veganism in principle, and he and his wife will also be starting a new podcast on antinatalism, so that's another thing to look forward to. Speaking of Islam versus antinatalism, an article criticizing antinatalism was published in a journal called Journal of Sirnak University, the Faculty of Theology. I think this is a Turkish university. The article was titled, "Is Not Giving Birth a Virtue? A Theological Critique of Antinatalism from the Perspective of Islamic Ideology." And even though it is actually a criticism on antinatalism, it goes through history of antinatalism in a very nice way. It is not too long, but it also covers all crucial historical milestones of antinatalism. The criticism of antinatalism comes in 3 forms. One is a philosophical criticism, second is from Islamic theological point of view, and third is socio-ethical perspective. It's a common mistake in interpreting antinatalist arguments to assume that antinatalism is arguing for non-existence as a definite meaningful state, including this article. Claiming that non-existence is preferable because it avoids suffering may result in a significant ethical problem, since value judgments are only meaningful in relation to an actually existing consciousness. Absence does not provide a basis for value judgment. Therefore, it can be suggested that antinatalist judgments rely more on intuitive assumptions than on fully demonstrable rational foundation. It also seems to confuse, as is commonly done, between the instrumental and intrinsic value of suffering and conflate that with the value of life. The value of life lies not in the absence of suffering, but in the capacity to generate meaning despite it. The article frames an individual as a cog in the machine of transmission of values across generations. The elimination of birth would disrupt not only genealogical continuity, but also the transmission of meaning, morality, and faith. There are many such fallacies under the guise of theological framework and flowery language. I'm not going to go through each of them, but you get the idea. Juna Rasnan and Anas Machdor published a short article in the Journal of Medical Ethics, "Why Not Coercive Pronatalism?" The article questions and evaluates badness of state-enforced pronatalism. It compares other coercive practices enforced by some countries onto their citizens. For example, military conscription is accepted in many countries. The justification for conscription usually is the possibility of existential threat to nationhood, threat to culture of a particular country, and so on. So the article asks the question that if military conscription is accepted on the grounds of existential threats, then why could coercive pronatalism not be acceptable on the grounds of similar existential threats produced by declining birth rates? It then goes into nuances and differences between the 2 cases. Like in the case of conscription, it is mainly men who are conscripted. In the case of coercive pronatalism, it is mainly women who will be suffering. Also, there could be many different types of pronatalist coercion. It could be negative, for example, by criminalizing contraception and abortion, or it could be more passive by withdrawing funding and support for initiatives like family planning or Planned Parenthood, or it could be positive by undertaking forcible impregnations and other such interventions. There are also degrees in between these 2 ends. In all types of coercion, there will be someone who will have to make some sacrifices. In case of pronatalist coercion, it will be mostly women. So the article suggests that where coercion is employed by the state, the threat should be recognized as such by the coerced population. If the sacrifices are to be made by a specific group, especially a disadvantaged group, this should function as a red flag. And positive pro-natalist policies mandating the use of invasive physical or medical interventions on unconsenting individuals are probably unacceptable, whatever the level of threat. A new book in Hindi on antinatalism will soon be published. The title, which roughly translates to Birthless Revolution, the humanitarian side of antinatalism, Why is Giving Birth Unethical, by Shashi Khushwa, is arguably one of the first ones in Indian literature. It is first such book in Hindi and second Indian book only to Ameriki Anandi, which was published last month in Bengali. Shashi has a channel dedicated to antinatalism and is also a vegan. The description on the back cover roughly translates to say that this book highlights antinatalism with the philosophical, social, global, and Indian references to compassion and logic. It challenges us to rethink the values of our life and our society. At the time of recording this video, it is still not fully published, but congratulations to Shashi for completing this project and looking forward to the book. And finally, fifth speaker at the Anti-Natalist Advocacy Conference was announced this week. Zigmont is the founder and CEO of Child Free Wealth, co-host of the Child Free Wealth podcast, and author of the Child Free Guide to Life and Money. Jay will be speaking on preparing your finances for doing good. Now, even though Jay's topic is about doing good, because that's the topic of the conference, I think what Jay is doing is truly important, and this is because there are antinatalists across many countries. And with the growing awareness about antinatalism, there is a growing number of young people who are becoming antinatalists. A lot of them will not have access to state pensions. And I'm not referring to the ethical contradiction of expecting a pension while not having children. Just as a practical fact, there would be many young antinatalists who should be thinking about their retirement plan when they become old, when there is no one to take care of them. Therefore, it is important that they start retirement planning, they start thinking about their savings, their investments, their current income, their future income, all of those things. And from that perspective, somebody like Jay Zigmont is very important, even though, as far as I know, that right now most of his content is US centric, but I think it can be extended to many more jurisdictions. So I'm thankful that someone like Jay has taken this initiative. And those were the stories this week. I am sorry that this was a little long this time, but Rachel Wilson had to be responded. So thanks for watching.